Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We are back today with Brad Bortner, retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Most recently within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Brad served as the chief of the Division of Migratory Bird Management. We also have joining us Larry Reynolds, the waterfowl study leader for Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries and a frequent guest on the Ducks Unlimited podcast. So Brad and Larry, thank you again for joining us here. And I want to jump right in. In the previous episode here, we gave what was basically a refresher, a Cliff Notes version of Harvest Information Program, what it is, what the hunters' roles are in it, and a few other things that we wanted to emphasize relative to the importance of that program. But now we have a very important discussion that we want to follow up on, and that is some exploratory changes to the HIP registration process that are being rolled out in 2020 for some states. I think some of the listeners of this podcast probably know about these by now, but for others, just want to make you aware of those. I think it's some very exciting changes. Brad, I want to go to you right off the bat with this question. Have you kind of set up this issue for us and tell us what's going on, and perhaps why this came about? We actually, I'll kind of go back to an episode that we had with Kathy, and she referenced some of these potential changes coming down the pike, and here we are. And this is one of those issues where all data collection systems are imperfect. Our job as responsible managers of this particular resource for the data collection that it's to which it's relevant is to look for those areas where it might be imperfect and always seek opportunities to improve those. And that's what we're finding right now. So Brad, I'm going to hand this over to you. Set this up for us. Talk to us a little bit about where we are with respect to these exploratory changes. You have a very important role in this, and that's why I'm going to go to you for this. So yeah, just tell us what it is that's afoot on the Harvest Information Program landscape right now.
Sure, Mike. When in the 90s, when the HIP was developed, it was a cooperation between the 49 states that hunt migratory game birds. Hawaii does not have migratory game bird hunting seasons, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And recognizing that every state has a separate licensing program, HIP is administered in 49 different states differently. There's slight differences in every state and how you license, what type of licenses they issue. But the bottom line is there's a federal requirement that every person that is hunting migratory game birds must register for HIP, and that name and address and answer file get sent to the Fish and Wildlife Service. But if you can see that with those 49 different approaches to HIP, it's created some issues, and that with the declining response rates that Kathy alluded to, long-term trend in hunter numbers, declining of response rates, and then changes that come about in HIP. When states change their licensing systems, as we all know, every state is moving on to point of sales or electronic versions of licensing. It has created some issues, and one big one that has been identified is either the vendors at a point of sale, like a sporting goods store, not asking the hunters questions, or trying to speed through it and just putting in answers for hunters, or hunters not understanding the survey and just putting down zeros, or they don't intend to hunt. And we found a high percentage of hunters in some states are saying, yeah, I'm getting hit, but I didn't hunt last year and I don't intend to hunt this year, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And so when the management community that includes all the state fish and game, fish and wildlife agencies and the Fish and Wildlife Service and some other partners started discussing this. They decided to start looking at different factors that were affecting the accuracy and precision of the HIP estimates, and decided that they would like to see if they can take a concerted effort to look at that. And the Wildlife Management Institute, the organization that I'm working for right at the moment on a part-time basis, stepped up and said, okay, well, they would take the lead on trying to work with 6 to 8 states and to try to make some changes to see if that helped improve the efficiency, the accuracy, and the precision of the HIP estimates. And so based on the experience in a few states, we started looking at ways where the hunters are directly answering those questions and giving that information to the state fish and wildlife agencies. And so I've been working with a number of different states to come up with a state-specific way of collecting that information where there isn't as much of an opportunity to have somebody else alter the information or not accurately provide the hunter's information to the state.
Brad, I'll come back to you in a minute, but I want to go to Larry now. And because Larry, I know from some of the emails that we exchanged leading up to this episode, you have a particular interesting story, you might say. It's basically what you've seen in your state that has alerted you to some potential issues with some of the very things that Brad just talked about. Can you kind of walk us through, share with the listeners some of the things that you saw that made you realize we can do better than this?
Well, we've long known that especially some of the larger retail license vendors have either been filling in the questions for the hunters or bypassing the questions completely. Myself and my right-hand man intentionally buy our licenses at different places every year. And I can tell you that in the last 12 years, I've only been asked the HIP registration questions twice in those 12 years. So we knew, we've always known that there's been a little bit of an issue. But I had always assumed that as more people buy their licenses online, that it would be less and less of a problem. But it really slapped me in the face this year when we conducted the 2020 Waterfowl Hunter opinion survey. We do a big hunter opinion survey every 5 years, which corresponds to the timeline for us with our opportunity to change our zones and splits options. And so we went to conduct this waterfowl hunter survey. And so we took the HIP registration database and we looked at all of those hunters, and we wanted to make sure that our survey went to waterfowl hunters. And so looking at those HIP registration questions, what we found was that 74.7% of the migratory bird hunters in Louisiana that had registered with HIP, 184,000. Almost 75% of them, according to the HIP registration database, did not hunt any species of migratory birds the year before. And that is completely and totally absurd. There is no possible way that's anywhere near correct. And what it told me is that there is an alarming rate of licensed vendors not asking the HIP registration questions. And actually, once I got into the way that our particular vendor has created the HIP registration page, it actually has an active continue button at the bottom. So instead of the licensed vendor asking the hunters the question, they just click on HIP registration. It goes to the page to get all of that additional information, and they just hit continue. And the hunter is registered with HIP with did not hunt for all of the different species. Well, now it's costing me resources because now I can't tell. 75% of 184,000 migratory bird hunters, I have no clue whether they're dove hunters, duck hunters, goose hunters. And so how do I decide who to send my survey to? Well, it was pretty easy. I sent it to everybody. Everybody that had an email address, had a HIP registration and an email address, got my survey. And when we got the responses back, 29%, nearly 30% of the responses came back to me from people who have not hunted waterfowl in the state of Louisiana for at least the last 5 years. And so it was a classic waste of time, energy, resources, and a little bit of hacking off my migratory bird hunters that said, why are you sending me a survey when I've never hunted ducks or I haven't hunted ducks in the last 5 years? So it became clear to me that we had a solvable problem that we could attempt to take on by making some changes in the way we do HIP registration.
Larry, I've experienced that. Pretty much every hunter, I think, has, if they've obtained their HIP certification at a point of sale at a vendor, they will have experienced that situation where either they were not asked the questions, or maybe the clerk would have offered to answer the questions for them, or just to offer an answer that would allow them to get through it as quick as possible. I've had that happen before, and it's oftentimes very difficult to undo that once they've started the process or once they've actually submitted the information. And we talked with Paul about that as well, and he's had that similar experience. And so, I mean, obviously, when you have the degree of the issue as you described there, based on what you found issue, is a serious problem. Now, so I have to ask you a couple of questions here. Have you heard from any of your other state colleagues that may be having similar issues, or is this only an issue for Louisiana?
Oh no, there are a number of states that are having similar issues. I've been working very closely with my colleague in Arkansas. He has generated some excellent information, and the reason that I've paid special attention to Arkansas is because they have the same license vendor that we do, and they're having similar issues. I've heard from Kathy Fleming that there are other states where the number of HIP registrations that are all did not hunt have increased dramatically in recent years. And so, no, Louisiana's not alone. We're just among those states that are in this pilot study to see if we can have some success in remedying that situation.
Now, I have to ask a natural extension of this particular issue here. If we're seeing this kind of problem with the HIP certification, the HIP registrants, do we know how that influences our estimates of the number of waterfowl hunters and the number of harvested waterfowl? Do we understand that?
I think that probably has a variable effect in different states. In Louisiana, it's probably a pretty big problem. I may be even understating that a little bit, because our license structure has a variety of licenses that exempt that hunter from buying a duck stamp. I have no hard license sale that allows me to estimate the number of duck hunters in the state. I talked earlier about the migratory bird license in Missouri. It has no exemptions. It doesn't matter how old you are or which migratory bird you hunt, you have to purchase that migratory bird license. But in Louisiana, our lifetime license holders, Lifetime licenses allow you to hunt ducks, but you are exempt from purchasing a state duck license or a state duck stamp. Senior licenses, anyone over the age of 60 in Louisiana does not have to buy a state duck stamp. Louisiana sportsman license. And so when I look at the license sales, I have no clue how many duck hunters, or at least potential duck hunters, there are in the state of Louisiana. The migratory bird license in Missouri, the state duck stamp in Arkansas is required of everyone. There are no exemptions. So if in a state like Arkansas, the HIP registration issues are a little bit less of a problem in estimating duck numbers because they have those duck stamp sales now. And I'm talking about this from a state level now. For me, it's a bigger problem. I have depended on the HIP database to give me some index as to changes in waterfowl hunters over the years. Now, when it comes to the federal estimates of hunter numbers, I've got to believe that it is a much more serious problem, but Kathy Fleming and Paul Padding would be a far better source of information on that.
So, Mike, let me throw in my 2 cents. It is at a state level. Obviously, it's a problem. And I always try to avoid picking out individual states and pointing out problems, but we've had problems with other states where by one year their vendor sent us the deer hunters, and I as chief used to get hate mail from me saying, "I've never shot a duck in my life. Why are you asking me how many ducks I shot?" And so there are problems out there, but if you, without getting into the nitty gritty on statistical theory and everything else, what it primarily does is it makes the surveys less precise. We still have an estimate of the number of hunters and the harvest at a flyway basis, at a management unit basis. That's pretty good, but when you start getting down to the state level, the confidence intervals or the confidence that we have in those estimates, starts to deteriorate. And certainly when you get down to the county level, it becomes less and less precise. Nevertheless, that's why we're working on this. Is we throughout the management community feel like we can do a much better job by changing some of the procedures, but also educating hunters about the importance of this and why they should care about it.
Brad, that's a great segue. So let's just go right into that with you. Talk a little bit about the pilot study that's underway, and where is it underway, and what are we trying to accomplish?
So I'm working with 6 to 8 different states in all. We're trying to get 2 states in each of the 4 flyways to develop systems in that state where hunters are interacting directly with the state agency to answer the HIP stratification questions. And whether it's an approach by web entry or a telephone authorization, we're trying to, in each state, trying to design the approach that unique to that state that they want to take, that interacts best with their hunters. But it's basically, in the Atlantic Flyway, we're working with Connecticut, North Carolina, in the Mississippi Flyway, Louisiana, and I'm hopeful that 1 or 2 other states. I'm talking to a few other states, and as Larry has indicated, Arkansas is one of those states that is considering some changes in the Central Flyway. I've been working with Kansas. And in the Pacific Flyway, and is Arizona and Montana, which is both Central Flyway and Pacific Flyway. Been working with them and expect them to implement changes for the 2021 license year that will have hunters directly reporting the answers to those questions to the state agencies, and hopefully, as a pilot, we can demonstrate that we can get more precise information, better information, and it feeds into higher quality data going into the harvest surveys and more precise estimates of harvest for all the different species. We kind of danced around it earlier. The species questions are very important too. Is the one I like to show is like to talk about is trying to determine the number of rail hunters. All of us probably know that there is rail hunting allowed in the eastern three flyways, but I'm not sure how many people that that harvest rails. So you can imagine is if you go through and try to find those, if the Fish and Wildlife Service or the states tried to go through and randomly contact every migratory bird hunter in the state, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack. So it's much more helpful to have the answers to those questions. So we're directed directly to those rail hunters.
Brad, have there been any states that have, because I know this isn't the first time the issue has kind of surfaced and people have kind of sought some refinements, some adjustments to improve the quality of the data. Are there any states that have done a good job kind of tackling this on their own outside of the pilot study before now?
Kentucky, a few years ago, under the of leadership of Karen Waldrop, who is now with Ducks Unlimited, and the state waterfowl biologist John Brunges, did implement a program with where all of the state migratory bird hunters need to either get online or make a phone call and get their HIP certification registered. They have had great success doing it, and it has helped improve the accuracy of their data. And that was one of the things that really opened up people's eyes that it is possible to make great changes and not make it too much more difficult for hunters to answer those questions.
So, Brad, to be clear, that basically means that Kentucky took those questions out of the point of the retail vendors, right? In other words, if those hunters now, migratory bird hunters now have to go online or make a phone call. They can no longer get HIP certification at those retail vendors, right?
That's correct. If you're hunting migratory birds in Kentucky, you've got if you're getting your license at a point of sale, after you get it, you have to get online and tell them that you have a HIP certification that you want to register. You either fill out the answers to the questions online or on telephone, and you get back a registration number, and that registration number is written on your HIP, and you're good to go. And the law enforcement agents in the states have ways to verify that if they encounter you in the field, and they also have ways for you to go ahead and register in the field if you haven't done it, but you have your HIP certification in your license material.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
Larry, I want to talk to you about what Louisiana's kind of efforts in this regard. I know I've seen some emails from you. I've seen some announcements from Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries about the changes in this regard that your agency is implementing. And so any of your hunters that will be listening to this will certainly be very interested in what you have to say if they weren't already aware. But but just talk to us about the changes, the nature of the changes that Louisiana is making.
We actually used Kentucky as a template to some degree in our efforts to eliminate third-party HIP registration. We are requiring all of our migratory bird hunters to get their HIP certification online or at the LDWF headquarters in Baton Rouge. Those are the only two choices. When a hunter goes to a retail license vendor and buys his license, he is informed that HIP certification is no longer available there and directed online. And so it's actually pretty straightforward and simple in Louisiana. You're forced to register with HIP online or at the Baton Rouge headquarters.
Larry, we talk a lot about how HIP certification is required. And of course, the logical extension of that is the recognition that if a migratory bird hunter is in the field, they don't have their HIP certification and they're checked by a conservation officer, they can be issued a citation. Now, in Louisiana this year, you are implementing a new system by which migratory bird hunters are required to obtain their HIP certification. And I know there's always kind of a learning curve with these types of things. Do you expect citations for failing to have HIP certification, at least by your state law enforcement, to occur with the same regularity and same kind of level of enforcement as in past years? And recognizing that there may be some situations where people just aren't aware of the change or maybe just couldn't figure out exactly what they were supposed to do, or they got confused by what they were supposed to do. What do you expect in that regard?
Well, I hope not this first year. That's going to be part of our outreach effort and our ask for communication with law enforcement officers. We're hoping to roll our law enforcement folks into some compliance checks and some reminders. I think it's a great opportunity for interaction between our law enforcement folks and hunters. There are some great stories of our law enforcement officers actually helping people buy their duck stamps online, because that's something we can do in lieu of writing them a ticket. And so our intention this first year, through outreach and education and compliance checks, is to transition into this. I've received a number of angry phone calls, as you can imagine, since this has been started. And one yesterday was a business owner in central Louisiana, a really great guy who was calling me literally out of concern for his older customers. But he was pretty angry that our solution to this problem, this problem is caused largely by retail license vendors not doing what they have agreed contractually to do. But yet, that's great, Reynolds. So your solution to this is not to fix the source of the problem, but to make it more difficult for our hunters to be legally licensed to hunt waterfowl, especially, my uncle and my father that are 83 and 85 years old. And he was pretty angry and going on about me a little bit about rural areas and people not having online access. And I told him at the time that I have yet to meet a human being that doesn't have a child, a grandchild, or a friend that can help them go online and get their HIP registration. And he thought for a minute, it kind of stopped him a little bit. And he said, "You're right. I could do that for my dad and my uncle, couldn't I?" And so I understand where they're coming from. I really do. the fact that you used to walk into Walmart and get all your licenses and walk out and you're ready to go. Now we're forcing you to take an extra step, and it's not your fault that happened. But it's important to me, and I think it's important to everybody, because harvest data is being used more and more now than ever before. Brad already explained that those estimates are going directly into our harvest strategies. We're now looking at estimating population size using Lincoln-Peterson indices, and harvest data is the numerator in that Lincoln-Peterson index. It's never been more important than it is now, and so we've got to do everything we can to improve the system. And the last point I want to make is, obviously I'm on the front lines with hunters. I'm at the public meetings. I'm doing the notices of intent. I'm doing workshops. And there are a lot of hunters that don't think the harvest data is meaningful at all. And one of the reasons is because, well, here you are, Larry, talking to us about all these problems with HIP registration. So how can you use the harvest data for anything? Why should we believe you that Louisiana still kills more ducks than any other state in the Mississippi Flyway besides Arkansas? And what everyone needs to understand is that even if HIP registration provided nothing but names and addresses of migratory bird hunters, if these HIP registration questions went away and weren't asked, we still have a scientifically sound foundation for generating statistically and scientifically meaningful harvest estimates. It's just that they would be less efficient, more variable, and require a lot more money to get done than if we make these improvements in the HIP registration process.
Larry, one other thing that I want to touch on, give you an opportunity to respond to is, and I don't think we've touched on this yet, and I know it's been a point of concern for some of the folks in your state as these proposed changes have come out. And let me ask you, I guess, a couple of questions. Is this a permanent change at this stage, or is this a sort of trial pilot study for Louisiana? Is it sort of a time-limited trial?
It doesn't have a sunset clause, if that's what you're asking. But we are doing this as part of a pilot study. If it doesn't work, we're not going to keep doing it. We're going to find some other way to get this done. But Mike, in all honesty, this is the way the world is going. There really is very little need for retail license vending. When you can do everything online, when you can purchase all of your licenses online, and you can print it out on a printer, or you can save it to your phone, you can keep a PDF file in your emails. Everything about this is taking us to what is the predictable and expected next level.
Larry, I want to come back to something. I never finished the question I was going to ask you a minute ago. Earlier in this episode, you made reference to HIP certification being free in Louisiana. And I know, having lived there for 13, 14 years, I know that was the case. But I also know that is changing now in response to this new way of doing it. And I know anytime there is a fee increase, a fee change of any sorts, it creates, unless it goes down, then people are happy. But if there's a new fee or an increase in a fee, I mean, that's understandably people have a sort of a negative reaction to that. And I know that's kind of been the case here. But I just want to give you an opportunity to explain that fee, explain the reason for it to your Louisiana hunters.
There's been no change in fees. A HIP certification is still free, but there has always been a $2 convenience fee for any online transaction. So if you buy your hunting licenses online, if you register for a lottery hunt online, any online transaction through our website incurs a $2 convenience fee. And one of the issues, one of the aggravations about this change that we're making is that we are requiring hunters to register with HIP online. The only way for them to not do it online is to come to the headquarters in Baton Rouge. And that online HIP registration incurs a $2 convenience fee, which has aggravated a few hunters because they've made it clear that you have inconvenienced me by forcing me to go online and get my HIP registration, and then you charge me a $2 convenience fee, and it is indeed a negative part of this change. This is the last year of the 3-year contract with our current vendor, and we are currently in negotiations for the next 3 years. And that convenience fee for a free privilege, the HIP certification, is being negotiated. So that may well change next year. I mean, if I have anything to say about it, it will certainly change. But for this year, any online transaction will incur a $2 convenience fee. And that includes if the only reason you had to go online was for HIP certification.
But now, if you obtained your HIP certification along with your hunting license online, you only incur a single inconvenience fee. You only incur that convenience fee once, correct?
That's correct. And it's been kind of fun talking with hunters about this. Like when you talk to someone that says you're making it more difficult for hunters to get licenses. And I know as soon as they say it, they go, uh-oh. Yeah, because you could be in the middle of the woods in backcountry Louisiana, or standing at a boat ramp at 4:30 in the morning, and you can buy your hunting and fishing licenses. It has never been easier to get fishing and hunting licenses. Sitting on the couch, watching TV, drinking an adult beverage, you can get yourself fully licensed to hunt or fish in the state of Louisiana, or I'm sure practically everywhere else. And so it's been interesting talking to people about it, but any change is difficult. It's inconvenient. It certainly is.
Larry, thank you for making that clarification and providing those perspectives. I always find these conversations enlightening and entertaining, and of course, anytime it's have you on here, it's also fun. So it's all great. But thanks for the great distinction in how some of those fees and there are kind of characterized there. So, and that's the way I buy my license now anyway, whether it be a fishing license, hunting license. And certainly now I think with everybody working remotely over the past 6 months, we're probably going to see even a greater shift in that regard. But enough of that. But
before you go on, Mike,
go ahead.
I need to make one clarification because, you've known me a long time, and I get distracted when I start telling a story or something from experience. But the important part of your question that I didn't say directly is that no matter how many licenses you buy or how many lottery hunts you register for or how many other things you do online, you pay one $2 convenience fee. So I bought my licenses for the first time ever. I bought all of my licenses online. I bought my hunting license, my fishing license, my saltwater license, my resident duck license, my federal duck stamp, my WMA permit, and my HIP certification. And for all of that, there was just one $2 convenience fee.
Now, Larry, am I correct though that you're charged that convenience fee for every online purchase session? Because I know I've made the mistake of going online, bought my hunting license or something, then I pay for it and log off and like, son of a gun, I forgot to buy this. When I go back, I then have to pay another $2 convenience fee, right?
That's correct.
So I just want to make sure we clarify that too. So Brad, I want to come to you for the next question, and we're getting close to wrapping this up. This has been a long episode, but it's been an informative episode, and I know it's really important for hunters, and I hope they really enjoy this information because we have two of the experts to discuss this topic on with us. So we talked about the pilot efforts that are either underway or that you're trying to line up. So the logical next question is, once you have a couple years under the belt for this pilot study, then what? Do we know kind of what the next step is at that point? Or was this just an effort where we said, we have to develop the conviction to at least try something different? Is that kind of where we are, or are we beginning to look down the road and do we know what the next steps are?
We don't have the next steps lined out. We're not sure what the results are going to be, but we're hopeful that this is going to end up in improvement and give us more reliable information once we improve the quality of our data. And that will increase the utility both for hunters and for setting up hunting seasons. But we think that the management community, the flyways, the states, and the Fish and Wildlife Service think that the effort is worth making to see if we can improve the quality of data, not compromise how we sell licenses, and make it more difficult to hunters. Larry made a great point that, there's a digital transformation that's happening in the rest of the world, and states are looking to make license purchases easier, simpler, whether it's through apps or your online experience or telephone or text. Change is coming. We're hoping that HIP can be part of that change, and we'll get better data from hunters and be able to utilize that better for management purposes.
So then it's reasonable to think that if this pilot study shows progress, then that provides additional templates, additional experiences from which other states that may not be participating in this pilot study might then be able to kind of seize upon the lessons learned, the experiences to implement their own set of improvements. That's kind of the idea.
Absolutely. Especially with a state like Louisiana stepping up and being first in line, as important as they are for waterfowl harvest, if it's successful in Louisiana, I think you're going to see a lot of other states take efforts like that or develop their own unique efforts to improve the quality of their HIP data.
Very good. And I know there's a lot of communication efforts underway, certainly in Louisiana, and I'm assuming any of the other states that are participating in this, they will also be communicating these changes to their constituents, and that's all great to hear. I think that's going to about cover it, but I want to give each of you, Larry and Brad, an opportunity to make any final remarks. And Larry, I'll start with you first. So any closing words for our listeners?
These changes that we're making in Louisiana are kind of a first step. There are a lot of issues that influence the quality of the harvest estimates. I've already talked about harvest estimates being more important now than ever for the management of our resources, for the optimization of our hunting opportunity. And there are other things Kathy Fleming discussed in the earlier episodes, changes in response rates. We're talking about modernizing the way these data are collected, maybe through photographs of wings rather than the actual wings being sent in. There's modernization going on that we need a improved sampling frame to evaluate. And that was a point early on. This HIP pilot study was not a no-brainer for all of the flyways. There was a lot of debate. There was a lot of dissension. There's some disagreement between states about the inconveniencing of hunters by making them take another step for HIP certification. But in the end, for us to get at the other problems, the other potential sources of variation and difficulty in the harvest estimates, we need to get the sampling frame right. It shouldn't be that difficult. We should be able to develop a protocol that does so effectively and quickly, and that's really where we're trying to go with it.
And Brad, any final words from you?
The important thing is for hunters to understand what their role is and why it's important for them to participate and why they benefit from high quality data in there. I know that the three of us are all avid waterfowl hunters and want to perpetuate waterfowl hunting or migratory bird hunting, and want certainly all the other listeners out there to understand that that they play a role, that we all see the role that we contribute to this cooperative endeavor that we call migratory bird management.
That's a great point, Brad. And as we reflect back on the history of waterfowl management, migratory bird management in North America, hunters have always played a crucial role in helping us find solutions or bring resources to deliver solutions to problems, whether they be habitat related, population related. Now we're talking about an issue, a problem as it relates to some of the data that we use to manage this resource. And yet again, here we see hunters being a critical part of the solution. And so that again just speaks to the absolute essential role that hunters play in the entire migratory bird enterprise. And that should be a point of pride for every migratory bird hunter in North America, recognizing the crucial role that they play. And so I know the three of us extend our thanks, and our organizations extend, Brad, I should say your former organization extends our thanks and gratitude to the hunters that in so many ways are responsible for helping this migratory bird conservation enterprise go forward. So Brad, Larry, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your time and expertise. This has been great. I've enjoyed it, and look forward to catching up with you sometime in the future.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. And thanks to you and all my friends there, DU, and all your members.
A special thanks to our guests on today's show, Brad Bortner and Larry Reynolds. We greatly appreciate their extensive time on this topic, a very valuable topic, important topic for all hunters to be aware of. And certainly, again, we thank hunters for their important contribution in every aspect of waterfowl and migratory bird management. We also thank our producer, Clay Baird, the editor of these shows, who does a great job making us sound better than we are and then getting these podcasts out to you, the listeners. And of course, the listeners, as we say every time, you are the most important part of this venture. We thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.